Hello, everybody. Hope you can hear me okay. What I want to do is just briefly cover the purpose and the objective of these sessions to hopefully help educate a lot of people in terms of what we're doing. But just want to help companies understand and develop, some of the building blocks for an MRO. It is generally the too hard basket. Most people just get really frustrated with the inbound indirect supply chain, which we're going to focus on more here. And so we're trying with these webinars to kind of help people get little nuggets of information to help them move forward and can potentially significantly reduce cost to your business. And again, that goes to the objective as well. This is the unloved world. They're the unloved materials in more ways than one. So by helping people understand and companies understand how, when, where, and why we have these materials and the impact that they have, I think the realization of the potential is enormous. It's effectively MRO materials is a multi-trillion-dollar industry globally, and it's just the too hard basket. So we're hoping to address that with this series we've started. So the first one we had back in June was more about the general point around cataloging. And then we talked around the standardization of the cataloging. And today on the opposite end, we're going to talk around, free text and why it's used kind of, and why it's so dangerous to a business from a spend perspective. In the subsequent sessions, I'll talk around, inventory stocking strategies. That's often misconstrued in terms of how you use your MRP to actually effectively plan materials, and whether you're using safety stocks or reorder points, min maxes, or reorder points and reorder quantities. We'll discuss those next time. And then the last one, which I find probably one of the weakest, is the procurement, where people, whether you're using outline agreements for automation or info records or not, is really interesting. I find it a big weakness, and we throw a lot of people at our procurement strategies instead of trying to drive data and process automation. So we'll talk about that in the last series. Okay, just briefly, if you're in the session, you probably know what free text is. And just simply put, it's creating a demand without a material number and enforcing that through the procurement process, which is generally always manual, and it effectively becomes uncontrolled spend. Most of the time, in my experience, this spend is unnegotiated. So you end up paying retail rates in a lot of cases. Not always, but it depends on the business. But that is a significant problem. So if you have a high percentage of free text spend, you're going to have a high portion of your spend that's uncontrolled. I'm working now with a client that is in the mid 80s on free text spend. And so it was quite obvious once they sent me their catalog to review, and we're helping them with standardization and start driving down their free text by creating a better catalog. Half their materials had never been used because their free text is so high. So you get in this catch-22, and we've got to work on really reducing it, taking the business on the journey, and we'll talk around that. Okay, I kind of started touching on the inefficient processes. Now, if you think about this, and I've got another slide coming up that helps paint the picture a bit better, but the inefficiency with free text is interesting, because a lot of business, you'll find people can create a requisition quite quickly, but the amount of information that they have to collect and enter is 3 times that of using a catalog material number. In general, I did this exercise in a couple different companies, and it's always around a third or even a quarter of the effort when you use a cataloged material number versus entering a free text requisition. And excuse me, I'll probably talk more SAP speak in this presentation, which is where we tend to spend a lot more time and effort with companies with SAP. But if you look when a work order is triggered, and they're triggering a requisition from the work order to create the demand for a material, they have to enter many bits of information, primarily for purchasing, that adds no value to that person. So you don't have automation. It's very laborious. So it becomes a very inefficient process. And then you're constantly training your staff to work through these requisitions and turn them into purchase orders, expediting, confirmations, all these type of things. And again, so you can imagine the accuracy of the data. The key point here is the data that's required to be entered by the requisitioner adds almost zero value to that person in his or her job. So they're being forced to enter purchasing groups, material groups, certain specific pieces of data that drive the procurement space, but adds no value to the person that's putting in the V-belt into the motor. So you can imagine that really restricts the amount of quality information you're getting, especially when the business is in a reactive mode. And I like the saying, the old version was garbage in, garbage out. Well, garbage in becomes gospel out, meaning we know we're putting bad information into SAP, but whatever comes out, that's the gospel. That's what's triggering our downstream processes, whether we like it or not. Knowing we're getting bad data in, we have to react to the information that's coming out, or we have nothing. So you can imagine if you're getting a lot of bad information on material groups, you've got the category management team chasing contracts on a material group that effectively does not really have that spend. So it's a waste of high value resources negotiating contracts that will never be used. So this is a major piece of why we want to get rid of free text, because as you know, when you catalog, you take the time to build in the data that's going to be used effectively, especially downstream from an analytical perspective. Very, very important. And these are the connection of the dots, so to speak. Materials management. I was building this presentation. You're always trying to find pictures. I'm a very visual person, so I'm trying to find something and I talk a lot around visibility and availability of parts, especially, in my background for the last 25 years using SAP, trying to show the visibility and availability to the people that don't touch computers much has always been a challenge. So imagine this is the view that you have, but you've come so used to it, you just live with it. You don't know there's any better. It can be worse, but nobody's taking the time to provide you that better visibility. So the maintenance guys, this is what they see every day, and they have to live with that. So because it's so bad, we need more of them, and they have to slow down, and it takes them more time. So this becomes a very important piece in terms of convincing the business on why free text is a problem. And we'll come back to that in a few things as well. All right, so this was a slide that was developed in a company when I was in mining, which I found really effective. I quite liked the way they presented the information. So what it's showing is on the left side, effectively you've got the maintenance and the engineering side of the business on the top, and everything starts with your master data. So think of this from like functional locations, equipment, maintenance plans and strategies, measurement points, all those type of things. And then it works its way across. You could have reviews and approvals to make sure that information is correct. It goes into the planning world. These guys are thinking, ideally, these guys are generally working, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks plus. And then you got work scheduling, which is 0 to 2 weeks. And then you got execution, which is obviously here and now. Versus the supply chain, who's trying to support that. And this again is only from the material space. You start with your master data. So you think about material master data, purchasing master data, warehousing master data, all this type of stuff. It goes into your category team that's building, negotiating your outline agreements, as I mentioned before, based on spend analytics to try to drive automation, drive down costs through negotiated prices. It goes into inventory team that's trying to optimize the inventory that you have without reducing any risk. Over to your purchasing team. So these two are kind of, you could say, these are your tactical space. You've got strategic on the left, tactical in the middle, and then you've got your operationals on the right. And then all of this ends up with the warehouse guys to work with the work execution guys to really make things happen. Now, what we do is we overlaid after several meetings, and this is within Singapore team, thinking about, all right, how much effort do we find we're putting in these spaces? And it was pretty clear master data was something that had to be done, but the effort was low. It was smashing a functional location, build up equipment quickly. Do we have bombs? We don't have time. Put in a task list, just put in this material. I'll worry about the rest later. So you can imagine the review and the approvals based on management, because they haven't been in a good space, their ability to review and approve something was low. So they would just tick and flick. Work planning does their best to try to plan work, but it's very difficult when you live in a reactive world. So everything in this space that you think about is either planned or it's unplanned. To me, that's one of the most important metrics, is how much the work is planned and how much is unplanned, and obviously trying to move it to a planned environment. So when it's unplanned, work scheduling has a difficult time. When they get a plan, they try to plan that's easy. They can work through the requirements with the resources they have. But when they're constantly have break-in work, it just becomes hell. And then work execution, everything lumps on these guys that are actually trying to do the work, and it becomes a much less safe environment. And that's probably one of the most important things. Unplanned work is far less safe than planned work. When you can think through things, you commit the right resources, you create the right quantity of permits, you get the right equipment in place in time, and it's planned. So these poor guys or girls have to deal with all the administration of what they need. They're the one that's triggering the free text because I need it now. This job wasn't planned, and these are the parts that I need. They're not in the bill of material. So I need to go talk to the work scheduling guys to get a requisition moving. So all this work ends up in work execution. So you can imagine the level of efficiency of these guys is dramatically reduced. We'd in a mining company I worked for in the past, we did an analysis globally and found that world-class time on tools was less than 50%, and that was world-class. So their day can quickly fall apart if they're working in an unplanned world. It can be very, very frustrating for them. So then if we pass that down to supply chain, we looked at it, it was almost a mirror copy. If work execution is an unplanned world, it forces the supply chain into an unplanned world, and vice versa. So again, master data, we're creating material masters really quick. We don't have time to create info records. We don't put it on a contract because we don't have time. We'll do that reactively once we have more spin analytics, if they're any good. The inventory team is just trying to get the information as quickly they can, or the materials, to the work execution teams. They work closely with purchasing to get the information they need, cutting POs as fast as they can, with incorrect lead times. Hopefully the prices are right. If not, that affects the AP team and the purchasing team. And then the poor guys in the warehouse are getting materials lumped in off the truck, and we called it bin diving, when you're getting a B triple come in and they're trying to wade through all these cages of parts that just arrived to find what the work execution team need right now. So again, we end up in this extreme reactive world that just is a downward spiral. So I quite like this. It shows you this is not good, but this is reality for many, many, many companies. And so I'll come back to where we're trying to shift to by reducing free text. So kind of going on to now, how do we fix this? Where do I begin? And so what I started saying is, well, if you think about it, if you put yourself in a mechanic or an electrician, or if you're in Australia, they call them fitters and sparkies. Put yourself in their shoes, and if they're doing a breakdown job, the first thing they need to do is, I need to find out, if you're going to force me to search for these materials without doing free text, well, we've got to make it quick, clear, and effective for these guys to be able to find the material that they need. So if it's not in a bill of material, if it's not in a BOM, how do you make it simple for them to find a part that I need, or at least to do the search? And if you can't find it, then they're allowed to create the free text. This becomes an important thing. So as you guys all know, searching in SAP can be difficult at best, especially for somebody that's in the work execution space and doesn't know how to do these things, or does it very poorly. For one example, we had worked with a company that wasn't good in this. To get some mute on somebody's. Isha, can you mute everybody, please? So searchability. So what we did is we actually, because we didn't have a really good tool, we downloaded all the data we possibly could into Excel, and we created a weekly spreadsheet that was updated that people could search in Excel. And the whole point was just to make it easier for these guys to find their parts. So, and it would search long text, short text, internal text, basic data text for all the information that they needed, whether it was a manufacturer part number that they just found on the part, or it's all they had was a bearing, and you could do it by plant, you could do it by country. It gives them the ability to find things quickly. And that was a real positive thing, but it was a very manual piece that we had to do. So what we did with MDO, we're doing the same thing, is building a really good Google search into the tool. So the first thing they do is search, so we can make sure. And if you have a vendor part number or a manufacturer part number, that really quickens the process, really. Next is around visibility. Now I talk around Metanoia. Metanoia is a company that we've partnered with that have done a great job of doing a visual representation of equipment that I find fantastic. Like I mentioned, I'm a visual person, so they'll take your equipment and they'll do an exploded view of the parts and label them as individually, so you can find out stock on hand and things like this. So I encourage you to go look up Metanoia. Just do a Google search, you'll find them. Really, really handy tool. I think they're based in the States, but they also have operations in South America as well. So I'll talk around that because they provide the visibility of the exploded parts visually, which effectively becomes your BOM. From that links back to your materials and stock on hand, which is the next one down, your availability. So it talks around how much stock do I have? If I don't have it on hand, how long do I have to wait before I can get it? And so these are the key things that can frustrate the guys on the shop floor that says, well, it's just too hard, but if I can create a manual rec, I'm in control of the process. But then again, it goes back to what I mentioned before. What's the quality of the information that they're providing just to get their part quickly? And that's the catch-22. Next, I've only put a few pieces in here, is we need to look at the processes, because really you need to break it into bits. Because if you think, I like to put everything into 3 pillars, where you have your maintenance processes around EAM. So your enterprise asset master data maintenance, that's where you got your functional location, your equipment, your BOMs, your task lists, all these type of things, your maintenance plans, your items. That's one piece of master data that I haven't included here. I've really brought it down to two main areas, which is your purchasing and your inventory, because this is what drives the reduction of free text. Because people free text because either they think that's easy versus what they can get quickly out of the warehouse. So I'll give you an analogy. I was trying to think, how do you give somebody an analogy? So imagine you're living on an island, and for every day of your life, you've got to go to the mainland, and you have to get in a canoe, and you trundle off rowing across the river, let's say, just as an example. And so you've done this every day. One day somebody comes along and they build you a bridge, but you've been using this canoe for so long, you find it, I guess, simpler, because it's kind of mindless. You just jump in. Even though the effort's much more difficult to row across, it takes you much longer, we'll say 4 times as long. You know how to do it, and it's almost become automatic. Versus somebody provided you a bridge, you can drive, you're across with all the gear you need, you can carry more, boom, you're across you're over to the mainland, and you're more effective. This is kind of what it's like, is you're trying to convince the people in the canoe it's much easier to use a bridge, but it's change. It's different than what they've done in the past. And this is what we found, trying to teach the guys on the shop floor. Says, guys, you can enter 1/3 the information when you use materials. It's actually probably 1/4. You need the material, quantity, hit your availability check, and go. And it took us a lot of time to convince these guys to do that. And the biggest win in a project that I had was when the fitters came back, or the mechanics came back and said, Tim, you're right. It is actually much easier to use materials. That really was the win. So I'll come back to this stuff in a second, but you think from a purchasing perspective, having info records, which I really call those, that's the fundamental purchasing master data. That's what triggers everything. That's the information that eventually goes into outline agreements. And we like to apply the UNSPSC codes, which are globally recognized to help you do your spend analytics, regularly updating lead times. Just focus on one thing at a time and start building this. Next, we'll talk around this, and the next webinar is also your stocking strategies. Boy, we find this all over the place in terms of how people use MRP, whether a lot of companies simply just put in a safety stock, which is really simplistic and reduces the functionality of SAP, but it happens a lot. So how you use the combination of MRP and lot size, and linking that to an info record for rounding values and different things like that. So we'll talk around this. And exceptions. Rarely do I find a company that manages exceptions, which I just am gobsmacked by, because they provide you with your thumb on the pulse. That's transaction MD06 for those of you that are in SAP. Okay, so now if you can get to the desired impact on the same plan that I showed before, what you want to do is you want to move your effort to master data. Put yourself in the space of, if you had the right functional locations, equipment, your maintenance plans, your strategies, all the items within that, the task list, done right up front. Imagine the impact down this chain, I guess you could say. Your approvals, your reviews and approvals, they should take more time to think about what they're doing. This is the engineers usually thinking, okay, how is this going to impact my budget? What's the impact on risk? What's the lead time? What kind of capital work do I need to do? So you want to do your thinking here. And again, then that flows into work planning with shuts or turnarounds, and really putting the effort in this left side of the screen versus the right side. Because then scheduling becomes much easier. If you've got a much lower percentage of unplanned work, your scheduling becomes much easier, and then execution guys are far, far more effective. Okay, and then next, and the communication. So I didn't mention before, the arrows before was all the random communication that's going all over the place. In this kind of a world where you're thinking proactively, there's going to be a lot less need for texting and emails and team chats and things like that. And same with the supply chain. If we take the time, and this is the whole purpose of MDO, is to build very good master data through governed, controlled processes. And I'm talking your maintenance master data to your material master data, linking it to BOLMs all in one request. Automatically creating info records, automatically creating HERS records, all within one workflow. And we do this upfront. Then this information passes to the category team. They can make a decision based on the information provided. Should I put this in an outline agreement and renegotiate it or not? Then over to inventory team to justify the reorder points. Think about work with the warehouse team on the bin locations, frequency of movement close to the counter versus not close to the counter, things like that. And the purchasing team, automatically the purchasing team will already have an info record created and potentially on a contract. So the first time MRP runs, that order could be automated already. And the perfect order, I like to call the perfect order, the demand is generated from the work management team. The next time that order is touched is at a goods receipt, because you built all the data in to support that. I call that the perfect order. But if you think 2 points of contact versus what actually happens, you got the requisition created, you've got somebody reviewing it, you've got it manually being converted, you've got RFQs going out, coming back, then you're waiting for it, you potentially have to expedite it. Then you've got goods receipt, and if it's free text, it becomes invisible. So this builds into hours and hours of wasted time chasing up materials. We're getting close to the end. So this is the last piece, is really to do this. You're going to need tools to do it in a world-class space. There's a lot of things you can do manually. Like I mentioned before, we created an Excel spreadsheet that we updated weekly manually. And that wasn't a tool. What became a tool, I guess you could call it, but it wasn't with any purchase tool. So start small, but then start thinking large. So Metanoia, even from the little picture there, you can see this is how they take your drawings or even old paper drawings, and they'll build into their software an exploded view of everything. And the numbers across there link back to material numbers. So you can see, well, do I even have this part? Do I have stock on hand? Or not? Do I have a lead time so I can go get the part? So it's really, really powerful tool. And we link MDO to that tool so that we catalog the materials that are missing. So once they build that in, we find all the gaps. We'll go in and catalog, especially wear parts, anything that could potentially move or wear. We help the Metanoia team work with the site team to catalog those parts so they have all that information's pulled into Metanoia from a stock on hand perspective, and it's maintained on a daily basis. So you've got stock availability in Metanoia and SAP. And then clearly the MDO tool, which is around all your data governance compliance across all these areas. And we cover, as I mentioned before, vendors, purchasing, maintenance, everything to pull the supply chain closer. And then of course that's all fed into SAP or any ERP system. MDO is system agnostic, so is Metanoia. So it could be Oracle, it could be any other tool. But we just typically we find most of the work is through SAP. And so hopefully that helps give you a bit of an idea. One thing I didn't talk about that I've got another couple minutes I may speak to is metrics. I'd be keen to understand, if you have any questions, please send me a note on LinkedIn, is how many people actually measure their volumes or their volume of free text spend. I'd be keen to understand that because that's where step one is. You need to measure things to improve them. To improve them, you have to measure them. With that being said, I guess it's probably, thanks for your time. We're trying to keep these short and sweet, so we don't want to take up too much time in your day. A quick 30 minutes with maybe 15 minutes of question and answer, which we can do now. So if you have any questions, please put it into the question answer area. Okay, I got a couple of questions here. We got one that's just really excited for the session. That's good. Thanks for that. Another one is, how can MDO help with free text? Okay, so that's a good point. When if really we probably need to show you, because if I can give you a demonstration of the tool, I like to. I'm from a functional background, so my job is always working large corporates within the supply chain. And so what I like to think of, you got SAP and it's this knobby ball that's just very difficult to handle. What MDO is like a blanket that you put over it, and it's a filter for the information that goes into it. It smooths it, it filters it, and makes it simpler to understand before it goes into this dynamic, complex thing. And so you build the rules in terms of how the information comes in so that it comes in intelligently and it has approvals on it so that people can't just randomly put in anything. It does duplicate checks before it goes into SAP. So it's you could say it's almost protecting SAP so that it's keeping the garbage out. And you build this really smart, intelligent way of pulling information in. And we make it simpler. SAP can be very complex and detailed because that's what it is. So we simplify things and we have description generators. So the end user effectively is building the materials that are going into SAP because they're the ones that know what they need. I hope that helps. So MDO is basically helping you catalog things to enable you to reduce your free text and control your spend. And that's the critical piece. Okay, next one. My question is around my bridge analogy. And it says, so let me just read the question out. You talk about building a bridge, but this can be difficult. So how do you build a business case that can demonstrate that the bridge needs to be built in the first place? Now that's a good question, because if you're happily canoeing across the river, why would you ever need to build a bridge? because the people that are going across find it, this is fine. This isn't a problem. I get into my little canoe every day and I just go across and I do the work, even though it takes me 4 times as long. So this comes back to measuring. Everything needs, you have to measure things in small bits to identify where you have the wastage. And within indirect materials, there is a lot of waste. We have so much room for improvement. Hence why I get excited around the MDO tool, because we need to control it better. In mining alone, we had hundreds of millions of dollars in spare parts, and that was the vast majority of the working capital. And our ability to improve in that space was significant. In one mine alone, we reduced the free text from 65% down to under 8%. We did this in 9 months, and in the same time, because we forced the business to consume the parts we already had, we took $30 million out of the working capital. That was in 9 months. Our stock turns doubled, which means our working capital was immensely enhanced. So that got finance's attention, and they said, how many lanes do you want on that bridge? So that was the big win that really helped. And that became, I use that as a business case, I think, to prove the business benefits. Any other questions we may have? I'm hoping that I hope I've touched enough. We've still got a few minutes. It's only 1:33. One other space, I think, on metrics on the inbound supply chain, there's a couple other things you might want to consider. Is stock turns. How many people actually measure stock turns? And in the finished goods, that's very typical and it's very good. But are you even measuring stock turns on your indirect materials, which is typically low? Definitely, if you have a stock turn greater than 1, you're probably doing pretty well, which is pretty scary numbers when you talk to the finished goods guys, which are moving 30, 40, 50 times a year, depending on what they're doing. So once you get that number started, then you need to break it down, and you can do that by material type, MRP controller, UNSPSC codes, many different ways once you've got materials catalog, because now you have the analytics. Okay, now I've got another question here. Is it better to measure the the value of free text spend or the volume? Now that's a good question. So straight away, people tend to say, well, we spent $5 million on free text orders. But it's important to put a little bit more shape to that around, well, how many line items was that? Was that in 5,000 line items, or was that in 500? Makes a big difference, because it shows you the average value of each free text line and the effort that's going into the purchasing team. The greater the volume, the more effort and the more resources you're going to require in purchasing. And again, you got senior management constantly talking about value add. The employees that I have, what value are they adding to my finished goods and the revenue that I eventually generate? And typically, anybody in transactional roles, they become a target to say, well, are you actually adding value by doing this? Or are you just working hard? So we need to include both value and volume. And then once you have that, then you can put shape around, all right, are we going out because it's a big expensive piece and the engineers are creating requisitions manually and they don't take the time to catalog it, which is shocking because that's where a lot of the critical parts live. And they don't understand the SAP supply chain world. That happens quite a bit. So I often say that master data team should live with the projects team so that we can help them catalog and build the information way up front on the capital projects that they're building and putting in place, so that you have all this information when it goes live and it's built in. And for some sad reason, we lost that. That used to happen, in the 50s and 60s. You had no choice. You had to do that because everything was on drawings. So you were forced to do it. And with the ERP systems coming in, I think things got very complex very quick, and those skills were lost. So now everything became reactive. Oh, SAP says I need this information, so I have to go get it. Versus I'm going to feed SAP this information so that it works. Okay, I hope I've answered all the questions there. If there's anything else, please send it through. If not, happy to please reach out on LinkedIn if you have another session or something else that you would like me include in these little webinars. I'm thinking about doing smaller, more frequent sessions that's focusing on one specific topic, and it could be just vendor master data. It could be a specific piece of an info record and the value that it adds and why it's there and how you use it. It may be just on the stocking strategies that are around why would you use V1 and a minimum lot size. So reorder point and reorder quantity versus min and max. Why I should or shouldn't use safety stock. So if you have things that you want to see, I might start doing some small videos and start posting these in a series to help you understand. Kind of back to the other question is, how could MDO make SAP more effective? And you can work smarter versus harder. I've been using SAP now for over 20 years, so I've gotten to learn quite a few things, and it's amazing how I see people using it the same way they were 20 years ago. SAP and some of that functionality hasn't changed a whole lot. It's just it's enabled you to become more effective. There's a lot of good LIS reports in SAP that help you analyze that information. Effectively, LIS is, I call it SAP's pivot table. You can pull out some really, really good information out of the LIS reports, or logistics information system. So like MCBA, that's one report that I used to use a lot. You can pull out your stock turns, some really good things. MC $K, a good transaction for understanding your demonstrated delivery time or your lead times. So there's some really powerful things, and I just said most people don't know about them. So feel free to send those through, and I'll start building probably shorter, quicker little videos that I'll post that you can access at any time. So if there aren't any more questions, which I don't see any more popping up.
Tim, we have one more question. It's on the second one. How much estimated working capital savings can we look at for energy and ONG companies?
Oh, okay. Sorry. Where's that one? Let me see. Oh, how much estimated working capital savings can we look at for energy and oil and gas? Oh, geez. That is such a good question, because there's so much. Oil and gas companies are heavy working capital and spare parts. I would say, as a conservative guess, excuse me, 20%, easy. When I was in chemicals industry, I had potentially obsolete. We had $90 million in working capital in Australia, and we had potentially obsolete $40 million. So these are materials. Sorry, I'm going to drink a glass of water here. These are the materials that hadn't moved in 4 years or more. And so we had a turnaround every 4 years for all of our major plants. And these are the materials that continued to simply sit there. So and we had many that were 12 years plus with no movement. So once you start this process, and if you force the reduction of your free text, you're going to realize those benefits much more quickly, because you're going to force materials to go through the inventory process and potentially into your warehouse and create that visibility, and you're going to force the company to consume what you have. If you allow companies to free text, if you give them that ability, they know you've got a motor in the warehouse that's been sitting there, probably unprotected, dusty, dirty. It's been sitting there for years, and you give them the ability to free text, they will go buy a new one, because their responsibility is reliability of the plant. So they're going to go get a new one, bypass that one, and spend more of the company's money. This will also force the warehouse to look at preservation activities. So that's an important piece. But I would say easily, conservatively, 20%. There is so much money to be had. As I mentioned, we went from 65% in 8 and took out $30 million, and this was a single mine. We rolled that across more, and it just ramped up. The biggest thing, we went from a stock turn of 0.8 to 1.68 in the 9 months, because amazingly how fast it was consumed. And the interesting impact was, all of a sudden we had an inventory optimization tool that started creating thousands of requests to stock more of what we had because it now saw the consumption. And that's the kind of the ironic part. The more you use, the more it tells you to stock, especially low value materials, which increases the availability and visibility back to maintenance. So everybody wins except the warehouse. They have to stock more and stock take more. So thanks, Isha. I didn't see that question, but that's an important one. There is right now with the COVID world, there is massive opportunity to cut cost, and free text is one quick way to do it. So let me think here. I've got another slide, I think. Okay, so we already talked around these. So the next steps, we've got part 4 and part 5, which is stocking strategies, date to be defined. So keep an eye out for the invitation for that. Generally, it'd be about a month, maybe sooner. I don't want to wait too long if we don't have to. And then we'll talk around the procurement space because I find that a growing need in terms of creating automation. If you don't know, you can actually automate purchases off of info records, and I still haven't seen that done yet, which I don't know why, because it's full capability to do that. And if you have any questions or anything, feel free to send a message back to us. We appreciate your time, and thanks for sitting through the webinar.